The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 9 words on a single line inside a cream envelope with the Whitmore Estate letterhead embossed in gold. Make it play one last time, and the piano is yours. Thomas Hadley stood at the mailbox at the end of his driveway in Sudbury, Ontario, in the kind of October cold that comes from the north without warning. The kind that smells like iron and frozen grass. And he read those 9 words 3 times without moving. His breath came out in slow white clouds. The maple at the corner of the lot had gone completely red overnight. He had not touched a piano in 4 years. He folded the letter back into the envelope, tucked it into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket, and walked back to the house. From the kitchen came the sound of his daughter Isabel moving around, cereal hitting the bowl. The particular scrape of her chair on the tile floor she always dragged instead of lifting. She was 9 years old and did everything with a completeness that reminded him of her mother, an insistence on doing each small thing fully and without apology. She was sitting at the table when he came in, her school bag already packed and propped against the chair leg, her spoon making careful circles in the bowl. "You were out there a long time," she said. "Letter came. Mole. From who?" Thomas hung the jacket on the hook by the door. "Someone who used to know your grandfather." Isabel looked at him with the particular directness of a child who has learned that adult answers shaped like answers are sometimes not answers at all. She returned to her cereal. On the refrigerator behind her, held by a magnet shaped like a moose, was a drawing she had made the previous week. A piano, large and black, with a man sitting at the bench. The man had curly hair like Thomas, and the piano had smoke coming out of it. Though when he had asked her about the smoke, she had said it was music. That was just what music looked like when she drew it. Thomas made coffee and stood at the counter and thought about the Whitmore Steinway. He had first seen it 23 years ago when he was 19 years old and newly arrived in Toronto from Sudbury with a letter of introduction from his high school music teacher and the belief, not yet tested, that he was going to do something with what he could do. What he could do was listen to a mechanical instrument the way most people could not perform, not compose, restore. He understood the interior logic of a piano the way a doctor understands anatomy, not from the outside in, but from the inside out, knowing which part would fail and why before the failure became audible, hearing the particular quality of a note that suggested a hammer shank drying out, or a daver felt compressing unevenly over years. His first real work had been in a repair shop on College Street in Toronto, owned by a Czech immigrant named Petr Sedlak, who had restored instruments for the Czech Philharmonic before coming to Canada. Petr was not generous with praise and not interested in shortcuts. He had told Thomas on the first day, "A piano that sounds close enough is not close enough. Close enough is its own kind of lie." Thomas had understood that completely by the end of the first week, and he had stayed 3 years. When the Whitmore call came, Thomas was 22 and had just established himself as a freelance restoration technician, working out of a rented space in Kensington Market. The Whitmore family was old Ontario money. The kind accumulated quietly over several generations in resource and railway investment, and their estate outside of Orangeville included, in the main hall, a Steinway Model D concert grand manufactured in Hamburg in 1931. It had been purchased by Aldous Whitmore, the family patriarch, at an estate sale in Vienna in 1962, shipped to Canada at considerable expense, and played regularly until 1987, when it went silent. No one in the family could explain precisely why it had stopped. Several technicians had been brought in over the years. All of them had found things to adjust and replace. None of them had made it sound like itself again. Thomas had spent the first 2 weeks simply listening to it, not playing, not opening the lid and peering at the mechanism with a flashlight, sitting in the main hall each morning, pressing individual keys slowly and fully, tracking the decay of each note with his eyes closed and his full attention on what the sound told him versus what it should have told him. He found 3 problems, not 1. 3, layered through the instrument in different registers, each invisible to technicians who had been looking for one cause, because 1 cause is tidy, and 3 causes suggest you have not been thorough enough. The first was in the bass string scaling. The original bass strings had been replaced at some point in the 1970s, and the replacement strings, while technically correct in gauge and length, had been wound by a manufacturer that used a slightly different copper alloy for the winding wrap. Over decades, the acoustic difference between the original treble strings and the replacement bass strings had widened, creating a tonal fracture in the low to mid transition that was not obvious in isolation, but made the instrument feel disconnected from itself. The second problem was in the regulation of the repetition levers in the middle register, the mechanism that allows a piano key to re-engage the hammer before it is fully returned to rest position. The original Steinway regulation had been disturbed by a well-meaning technician sometime in the 1990s who had adjusted the repetition spring tension to modern specification rather than the original Hamburg factory tolerance. The difference was less than a millimeter of travel. It was the difference between an instrument that responded and one that merely reacted. The third problem was the most difficult to find and the most significant. In the soundboard, the spruce panel beneath the strings that is responsible for the piano's entire acoustic amplification, Thomas had located a compression ridge along the bass bridge area, invisible to the eye, detectable only by pressing his palm flat against the board and listening to the change in resonance when he applied slight pressure at different points. The ridge had formed from decades of string tension pulling the bridge toward the plate. It was not a crack. A crack could be repaired or worked around. A compression ridge was a permanent change in the wood's internal structure, and addressing it required a partial soundboard recrowning, a procedure so rare and so demanding that most technicians declined to attempt it, and most clients were never told it was possible. Thomas had been 22 years old, 8 months out of Petter's shop, and he had written everything down in a gray hardcover notebook, every measurement, every technical notation, every material specification required to address all 3 faults in sequence. It was the most thorough piece of diagnostic documentation he had ever produced. He had done it the way Petter had taught him, as if the information would matter to someone, someday, in circumstances that could not yet be foreseen. Then Aldous Whitmore had died. The estate had been placed under the management of a trust administrator while the family sorted the question of inheritance. The administrator, whose expertise was in financial instruments rather than acoustic ones, had frozen all ongoing work and expenditure immediately. Thomas had received a phone call on a Thursday afternoon informing him his contract was terminated, the estate was closed to non-family visitors until further notice, and any personal effects left on the property would be held in storage. His gray notebook was on the piano bench. He had received 60% of his contracted fee, no notice period, no formal correspondence, just the phone call and the click of the line going dead. That had been 23 years ago. He had built a different life after that. He had moved back to Sudbury eventually, following Christine, who had grown up there and wanted to raise children in a place that still had distance between houses and the smell of pine in the morning. He had worked steadily as a piano technician and tuner, servicing instruments for the school board, for private clients, for the occasional hotel that wanted its lobby piano playable. He was not famous. He was reliable, which in his experience was rarer and more useful. Christine had died of a brain aneurysm 3 years ago, on a Wednesday afternoon in February, without warning. Isabel had been 6. Thomas had been sitting in a school gymnasium servicing an upright Yamaha when his phone rang. He had taken the 3 months following her death and done very little with them except be present for Isabel, which was what she needed and what he needed, though he would not have used that word at the time. He had gone back to work in June. He had kept the routines that Christine had established for Isabel and added to them slowly, carefully, learning to be the person who was in the kitchen when Isabel woke up, who noticed when the drawing paper ran low, who attended the parent council meetings and did not feel, after a certain amount of time, like a visitor there. He had not thought about the Whitmore Steinway in many years. He had thought about it often. The letter was from Vivian Ashton, the youngest granddaughter of Aldous Whitmore, who had inherited the estate 3 years earlier after the death of the last of Aldous' children. She was 34 years old, trained as an architect, and she had written to Thomas because she had found, in the estate's archive correspondence, a file from 1999 containing his original diagnostic proposal, his technical drawings, and a letter from Aldous written 2 weeks before the stroke, expressing his intention to retain Thomas for the full restoration. The contract had never been signed. The stroke had come first. Vivienne's letter was direct and without apology for the history. She had opened the main hall and found the Steinway exactly as it had been left. She was hosting a commemorative concert in 7 weeks in honor of Aldous, and she wanted the piano restored and playable if Thomas could make it play. Not adequately, not close enough, but fully, the way Aldous had heard it play in Vienna in 1962, she would deed the instrument to him outright. A Steinway Model D Concert Grand in original 1931 Hamburg construction, fully restored, was worth, at current market between $400,000 and $700,000, depending on the quality of the restoration. She had not mentioned the gray notebook in the letter. He would find out later that she had not known it was there. Thomas called his neighbor Darlene Beaumont that evening. Darlene was 62, a retired French teacher, and the person Isabel trusted most in the world outside of her father. She had a guest room and a sensible schedule, and she did not ask unnecessary questions when Thomas explained he might need to spend time in Orangeville for the next several weeks. Isabel was at the kitchen table drawing when he came to explain it to her. "Is it a piano job?" she asked without looking up. "A complicated one." "Is it the one you never finished?" He looked at her. She had put her pencil down and was watching him with the same particular attention she gave to things she intended to understand rather than simply accept. "Yes," he said. She picked the pencil back up. "Then go," she said. "Darlene has better cereal anyway." He was on the highway to Orangeville before 6 the following Monday morning, the gray October pre-dawn sitting flat and heavy over the highway, and he felt something shift in his chest that was not quite nervousness and not quite anticipation. It was closer to the feeling of returning to something unfinished, the particular weight of work that has been waiting. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with spruce trees. The main house, a large field stone structure built in the 80s that had been added to over several generations without losing its original character. The main hall was through the east wing entrance, and Vivian Ashton met him there, tall, with her grandfather's deliberate manner of moving through rooms, as she shook his hand without ceremony and led him to the piano. It was covered with a canvas drape, the same style of cover he had removed and replaced many times over the 6 months he had worked there 23 years ago. He lifted it without hurrying. The piano underneath had not changed. The case was original, the spruce soundboard unmodified, the action intact behind the lid. Time had settled on it. The way time settles on things that have been waiting in still air. A fine layer of accumulated quiet that was not damage, just absence. He opened the fallboard and pressed middle C with one finger and held it. The note that came back was distant and clouded, like a familiar voice heard through a wall. There, but not present. Everything in him that had learned under Petcher's instruction recognized the sound immediately. This was not a piano that had been broken. This was a piano that had not been heard correctly in a very long time. He found the gray notebook on the third morning. He had been working through the treble register when he noticed the edge of the notebook under the piano bench, wedged between the bench and the rear leg. It had been there for 23 years, undisturbed. He pulled it out and held it for a moment before opening it. The cover was exactly as he remembered, gray with a water stain on the lower right corner from a cup of tea he had set on it without thinking during his first week of work. He opened to the first page. Whitmore Estate, Steinway Model D, Hamburg, 1931. Diagnostic Assessment. Hadley T. March 1999. His own handwriting, from when he had been 22 years old, looked back at him in the work light of the main hall. He set the notebook open on the bench and began checking each finding against the current state of the instrument. The 3 primary faults were exactly where he had recorded them. There were additional issues that had developed in the intervening years, dried-out hammer felts in the upper register, 2 broken hammer shanks in the bass that had snapped under the tension of unplayed strings, a loose tuning pin in the middle octave. Secondary problems. Addressable. He cataloged them all onto fresh paper and organized the work sequence. He had brought his full set of restoration tools, accumulated over 20 years, the voicing needles and the regulation calls in the small spring hook he had made himself in Petter's shop, because the commercially available version had the wrong angle for his hand. He had ordered replacement bass strings from a specialist manufacturer in Boston who wound to historical specification. He had also called Annette Beauregard, a soundboard specialist in Montreal who was one of 3 people in Canada he knew capable of performing a partial recroning procedure on a soundboard in this condition. Annette had agreed to drive to Orangeville on the 4th day. On the second evening, Vivian came to the main hall while Thomas was regulating the middle register action. She had a way of entering rooms without disrupting them, the particular habit of someone who is used to assessing spaces professionally. "The other technicians my trustees brought in," she said. "None of them worked like this." Thomas did not look up from the action. What did they do? Replace things, quickly. A pause, billed by the hour with a sense of urgency. He made an adjustment to a repetition spring and played the keys slowly. The response had changed. It was still not right, but it was closer. "The instrument doesn't need urgency," he said. "It needs sequence." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather wrote about you. In a letter to his solicitor, the week before his stroke, he said you were the only technician he had ever met who understood that a piano's silence is as informative as its sound." Thomas looked up then. "I didn't know that," he said. "I found the letter in the same file as your diagnostic proposal." Vivienne's voice was even. "There's also a record in the estate accounts of the amount owed to you from the 1999 contract termination. The remaining 40% with standard interest over 23 years is a considerable sum. The trust administrator at the time had no authority to terminate the contract unilaterally. That's a liability the estate carries regardless of this week." Thomas set down the spring hook. "I didn't come here to pursue that." "I know," Vivienne said. "I'm telling you because it exists and because it should be acknowledged. Some things should be acknowledged." She left him to his work. The crisis came on the fourth day, as Thomas had known it might, because restoration work always has a fourth-day problem. The moment when what you have planned and what the material will allow begin to negotiate with each other. Annette Beauregard arrived from Montreal on time, examined the soundboard for 90 minutes in focused silence, and then delivered her assessment with the directness Thomas had always respected in her. The compression ridge was worse than his 1999 notation had indicated. 23 additional years under string tension had advanced it. A partial recrowning was still possible, but the procedure would require removing the strings from the entire bass section and the action from the lower register, working exposed wood, and the piano would be unplayable for at least 48 hours during the procedure and cure time. That consumed most of the remaining schedule. "If we go forward," Annette said, "we have to go all the way. Half measures on a soundboard accomplish nothing and can make the resonance worse." Thomas stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the open piano. The bass strings were off to one side, coiled on a cloth. The action lay on the portable table he had brought. The instrument was completely exposed, the interior visible in the work light, the spruce of the soundboard pale and honest and waiting. He had thought about Christine on each of the 4 days, not the last months, not the hospital, but earlier, from when Isabel was small, and Christine would sit at their upright piano at home after Isabel was asleep and play slowly through pieces she had never fully learned, stopping when the music stopped making sense to her fingers and starting over again. She had never been a pianist. She had simply liked the conversation that happened between her hands and the keys in those quiet late evenings. She had told him once, when he asked what she was working toward, that she was not working toward anything. She was just listening to what she almost knew. Isabel called on the afternoon of the fourth day, while Thomas was waiting for Annette to complete the first stage of the regrounding. "Is it going okay?" Isabel asked. "It's complicated today." "What happened?" "The piano needed more work than I expected, in the part underneath the strings." A pause in which he could hear, faintly, the television at Darlene's house in the background. "Is it bad?" she asked. "No. It just means we have to go all the way. You can't do half of a thing like this." Isabel was quiet for a moment. "That's what you always say about mashed potatoes," she said. He stood in the main hall of the Whitmore estate with his hand over his mouth, because he did not want to laugh out loud in a space where Annette Beauregard was performing precision work on an irreplaceable instrument. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Dad," she said before he could end the call. "Yeah. Mom used to say you were the best person she ever met at finishing things." A brief pause. "I think she meant it." He stood completely still for a long moment after the call ended. Then he walked back to the piano and picked up his notebook and continued. The bass strings were restrung to historical specification on the 5th day. The replacement windings matched to the original Hamburg manufacture by the Boston supplier's archival process. Thomas spent 4 hours tuning them down from pitch, allowing the new strings to settle, then back up in careful increments, following the process Petter had described for new strings on old instruments. Patience is not a virtue here. It is a technical requirement. The regulation of the middle register was completed on the morning of the 6th day. He had saved it for last because the repetition lever adjustment required the soundboard work to be complete before final calibration, and because he wanted to address each fault in the sequence he had recorded in the gray notebook, not because the order was arbitrary, but because the sequence was correct, each repair building on the stability of the previous one. He was aware on the sixth day that he had a visitor. Marcus Vale had been the head of restoration at the Whitmore Estate Trust for 11 years, brought in by the previous estate administrator to oversee maintenance and value preservation of the property's assets. He was 53, precise in his dress and his language, and he had been the person who had authorized the 4 previous unsuccessful restoration attempts on the Steinway. He had not authorized Thomas's engagement. Vivienne had done that directly, over Marcus's written objection that an independent technician working without a formal team or institutional affiliation presented an unacceptable liability risk to a significant estate asset. Marcus had not come to the main hall during the previous 5 days. He came on the 6th morning, stood near the entrance, and watched Thomas work for a long time without speaking. Thomas knew he was there. He continued with the regulation sequence. Eventually, Marcus crossed the floor and stood at a distance where he could see the action laid across the portable table. "You replaced the bass strings to historical specification," he said. "Not a question." The replacement strings from the 1970s were the wrong alloy. Marcus lifted the string coils on the cloth. Then he looked at the action. "You're running the regulation from the notebook." "My notebook. From 1999. A silence. Marcus had the expression of a man who has spent 11 years organizing attempts on a problem and is standing in front of the reason all of them fell short. "You knew what was wrong 23 years ago," Marcus said. "3 things. In sequence." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I should have looked at the estate correspondence before I brought the others in." "The file was there," Thomas said without inflection. "Yes." Marcus stood a moment longer, then walked back toward the entrance without saying anything further. At the door he paused. "Vale," he said, "is the name on the authorization form for the 2016 attempt. The technician we hired charged the estate $40,000 and replaced the damper felts. The damper felts were not the problem." "No," Thomas said, "they weren't." The door closed behind him. The regulation of the repetition levers took 4 hours and 12 minutes. The original Hamburg factory tolerance was recorded in the gray notebook in a table Thomas had constructed from Petter's reference materials, and a specification document he had located in the library of the Royal Conservatory of Music during his second week of work in 1999. The tolerance was 0.7 millimeters of key travel before hammer re-engagement. Modern specification was 0.5 millimeters. The difference sounded like nothing. In a concert grand built in 1931 for performers trained on instruments of that generation, it was the difference between the piano speaking and the piano answering. When he finished the regulation and played the middle C scale slowly with both hands, the keys came back under his fingers with the particular quality of a mechanism that is working exactly as it was designed to work. No more, no less, precisely what was needed and nothing extra. He sat at the bench for a while without playing anything else. The demonstration was scheduled for 11 in the morning on Saturday. Vivienne had not told him who would be present, only that the necessary parties would be there. When Thomas arrived at the main hall at 9:30, he found the room arranged with chairs facing the piano, 6 of them. Vivienne stood near the window with Charlotte Perrin, the estate solicitor. Marcus Vale was present, to Thomas's mild surprise, seated at the end of the row. There was a woman Thomas did not know, introduced as Dr. Francis Okafor, a musicologist from the University of Toronto who had agreed to serve as an independent acoustic assessor. And there was Isabel. She was sitting in the middle chair in the second row with her winter coat still on and her hands folded in her lap, and she turned when Thomas came in and gave him the look she gave him when she considered something to have been adequately handled. "Darlene drove me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Your coat," he said. "I know." She took it off and put it on the back of the chair. Darlene Beaumont was sitting beside her, composed as always, and she gave Thomas a small nod that communicated, efficiently, that she had offered to drive, and Isabel had accepted, and this had seemed to both of them to be the obvious thing to do. Thomas turned to the piano. He had uncovered it that morning before anyone arrived and opened the lid to the full stick. The Steinway stood in the morning light from the hall's east windows, fully assembled for the first time in 23 years, the bass strings catching the light along their coiled windings, the hammers set at correct regulation height behind the open action, everything in its correct position and relationship. He sat at the bench, adjusted it for his height, placed his hands on the keys without pressing them. He thought about Petter, who had died in 2011, and who had once sat beside him at a restored Bussendorfer in the College Street shop and said, "You do not perform for the room. You perform for the instrument. The room overhears it." He thought about Christine, playing slowly through things she almost knew in the quiet of a late Tuesday evening, stopping when the music stopped making sense and starting again, not because she was trying to get it right, but because the conversation was worth having. He placed his hands and played. He began with a single low bass note, holding it fully, letting the room hear what the soundboard was doing, the way the recrowned spruce was carrying the vibration out through the bridge and into the air without compression, without the clouded quality that had been there 3 weeks ago. The note expanded into the room with a fullness that had not been present in this hall since before Thomas was born. He moved through the full range of the keyboard, not a piece, not a performance, but a systematic demonstration that was also in the way that all serious technical work is also something else, a conversation. The bass string spoke with the specificity the new winding had restored. The middle register responded with a speed the corrected repetition levers had given back. The treble sang at the particular register of a Hamburg Steinway built in the period when the factory was at its most attentive. He played for 12 minutes. When he finished, the main hall was very quiet. Dr. Okafor was writing in her notebook. Vivienne was standing at the window with her hands at her sides. Isabelle was watching her father with the expression she got when she was paying attention in the way that stored things rather than simply recording them. Marcus Vale had his hands on his knees and was looking at the floor with the look of a man making a private accounting. Thomas stood up from the bench and said nothing. Dr. Okafor looked up from her notes. "Mr. Hadley," she said, "I'd like to hear the bass transition one more time if you're willing." She said it the way a professional says something they have been trained not to show excitement about, the way someone says a thing when the thing they want to say is considerably larger. He played it again. She wrote for 2 full minutes after. The meeting in the library afterward was not long. Vivienne placed the deed instrument on the table, the Steinway Model D, Hamburg 1931, transferred in full to Thomas Hadley, contingent on the completion of the commemorative concert in 6 weeks, as originally discussed. The acoustic assessment would be included in the formal provenance documentation. Thomas looked at the document. He thought about the specific shape of what came next. The workshop he had been renting would not be large enough, but the building 2 streets over had been vacant since spring and had the ceiling height a concert grand required. He thought about Isabel's college fund, currently held in a savings account that felt, at current rates, permanently insufficient. He thought about the 8 other instruments he knew existed in private estates and institutional storage across Ontario. Instruments that had gone quiet for reasons that were correctable if you knew the correct sequence to approach them. He picked up the pen and signed. Vivienne set a second document beside the first. "The Estate Council has prepared this separately," she said. "The outstanding balance from the 1999 contract, 40% of the original fee with standard interest over 23 years. It does not affect the deed transfer. It was owed before this week." "I didn't come here for that," Thomas said. "The obligation doesn't require your intention to collect it," Charlotte Perrin said from the other side of the table. "It existed. It should be closed." He looked at Charlotte. She had the manner of a solicitor who had decided, at some point in her career, that her job was to represent the accurate state of things rather than the convenient one. He signed the second document. Outside, the October afternoon had cleared. The spruce trees along the drive were moving slightly in the wind, and the light on them had the particular quality of Ontario autumn light, direct and horizontal and very clean. Isabelle was waiting at the bottom of the stone steps with Darlene, her coat back on, her breath visible in the cold air. When Thomas came out, she did not run. She waited until he had come down the steps, and then she put her hand into his, the way she had since she was small, with a completeness that did not require any adjustment. "Was it right?" she asked. "The sound." "Yes," he said, "the sound was right." She considered this. What did it sound like? He thought about the low bass note expanding through the recroned soundboard into the hall, the way it had filled the space without straining, the way a thing sounds when it is working exactly as it was made to work. Nothing extra, nothing missing. It sounded, he said, like it had been waiting to say something for a very long time, and finally had the right person to say it to. Isabelle thought about this for a moment, the way she thought about things she intended to keep. "Like letters," she said. "A bit like letters," he said. Darlene brought the car around. and they drove north on the highway with the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and Isabel asleep against the door before they reached the edge of town. The way she always fell asleep in cars? Suddenly and completely, as if sleep were a decision she had made and immediately carried out. Thomas drove with both hands on the wheel and let the highway go under him. He was thinking about the workshop on Regent Street, the ceiling height, the loading door wide enough for a concert grand. He was thinking about the 8 instruments on the list he had not yet written down, but would write down when he got home tonight. After Isabel was asleep, in the gray notebook he would reopen to the first blank page after the last page of 1999. He was thinking about what Petter had told him in the College Street shop on an afternoon in late November when Thomas had been 20 years old and had just successfully regulated an action that 3 other technicians had declared irreparable. Pacher had looked at the work for a long time without speaking, and then he had said, "The instrument was not broken. It had simply been waiting for someone who understood what it was trying to do." Thomas had been young enough at the time to think this was a comment about the instrument. He understood now that it was a comment about most things. He reached over and adjusted the heat so it would stay warm in the back seat where Isabel was sleeping, and he drove north through the October afternoon toward home. I keep thinking about the moment Thomas pressed that first key in the Whitmore Hall and heard the note come back clouded and distant, like a voice speaking through a closed door. He had not played a piano in 4 years. He had not allowed himself to, and yet he recognized in that muffled sound exactly what was wrong and exactly what it would take to make it right. That kind of knowing does not come from talent alone. It comes from years of showing up honestly to the work, even when the work does not reward you, even when someone terminates your contract by phone on a Thursday afternoon and keeps what is yours. What strikes me most about Thomas is not that he succeeded. It is the reason he was the only one who could. Every technician before him had approached the Steinway looking for one problem, because one problem is efficient and tidy and billable. Thomas had spent weeks in 1999 looking for the truth of the instrument, whatever that turned out to be. He found 3 problems. He documented all 3 with the kind of precision that only comes from genuinely caring whether the work is done correctly. That is a form of integrity that most people skip when no one is watching, when there is no immediate reward for being thorough. He was 22 years old and working in a cold hall for a client who would, 2 weeks later, have a stroke and leave Thomas with 60% of what he was owed. He was thorough anyway. That notebook was not written for the $700,000 piano. It was written because some work deserves to be recorded as if it matters. That is what I think about when I consider what it means to actually know something. Not to approximate it, not to perform competence, but to understand a thing deeply enough that you can find the fault no one else can locate, in the dark, by feel. After 23 years, intelligence used honestly, directed by genuine curiosity rather than the appearance of expertise, is one of the rarest things I can think of. Thomas had it because he had been trained by someone who refused to accept close enough as a standard, and because he had chosen, year after year, to hold himself to that same refusal even after the formal training was long over. And then there is the question of what it cost him to walk back into that hall at all. His wife was gone. His daughter was 9 and still reaching for his hand in the unconscious way of a child who has learned that some people leave without warning. He had built a quiet life around being present for Isabel, and being present meant not disappearing into unfinished things, not chasing the version of himself that had existed before grief reorganized everything. Going back to the Whitmore estate was not simply a professional decision. It required a kind of steadiness, a willingness to sit with what had been interrupted and unresolved for 2 decades and not let that weight make him bitter or reckless. He went back because the work deserved to be finished, and because Isabel, in the particular wisdom of a 9-year-old, told him to go. I think the life we end up with is largely shaped by whether we do the honest work when it is inconvenient, whether we understand things deeply enough to see what others miss, and whether we are willing to return to the things we left unfinished and complete them with the same care we brought at the beginning. Thomas Hadley did all 3. The piano played because he had earned the right to make it play long before the letter arrived.